One of the most fascinating questions I often get asked is about the whereabouts of the 12 tribes of Israel. Did they really disappear in history? In this video, I invite you to join us until the end, as we explore not only the theories about the so-called lost tribes, but also the clues and evidence that may shed light on where they have been throughout the centuries. Embark on this incredible journey to unravel the mystery of the 12 tribes. Don't forget to like and share with friends and family who are also interested in this biblical enigma. Let's discover together. Where are the 12 tribes of Israel? Did they really vanish? Since the Israelites were freed from bondage in Egypt, they journeyed toward the land of Canaan, the land promised by God to Abraham as an inheritance for his descendants. However, along their journey and settlement, the Israelites frequently disobeyed the laws, guidelines, and commandments that God had given Moses on Mount Sinai. This disobedience brought severe consequences, demonstrating the importance of remaining faithful to the covenant established with the Lord. In the book of Leviticus, both the blessings and penalties associated with the obedience or rebellion of the people of Israel are outlined. God made a solemn covenant with the Israelites, commanding them to follow his instructions and worship him exclusively, rejecting idolatry and avoiding assimilation with the practices, customs, and gods of the peoples inhabiting Canaan or other foreign nations. This covenant was not merely a set of rules, but a commitment to faithfulness that would shape the identity of the people as a holy nation. In Leviticus chapter 26 verse 17, God warns about the consequences of disobedience. "I will set my face against you, and you will be defeated by your enemies. Those who hate you will rule over you, and you will flee even though no one pursues you." This verse illustrates one of God's judgments, where Israel, by disregarding the divine covenant, would be handed over to the domination of their enemies and lose their special protection. This penalty not only symbolized the distance from God's presence, but also resulted in a harsh reality. The tribes of Israel could be subjugated, scattered, or absorbed by the surrounding cultures and peoples. This cycle of disobedience and judgment is a recurring theme in Israel's history, reminding us of the importance of faithfulness and obedience to God to experience the blessings of his covenant. In verse 25, we find more details about the punishment announced by God. "I will bring adversary nations against you, bringing the sword to avenge my covenant. And when you flee to your cities, I will send the plague among you, and you will fall under the power of the enemy." The tribes of Israel had broken the covenant and alliances with God, turning to idolatry and other sins common among the peoples of the Middle East. In response, God allowed Israel to be dominated by neighboring nations who subjugated the Israelite territory. This is confirmed by history as the last kings of Israel, described by the prophet Hosea in chapter 8 verse 4, were considered illegitimate and usurpers of the throne of Israel. When the tribes turned away from God and gave in to idolatrous practices, he delivered them into the hands of rival peoples who competed for territorial dominance, reducing them to vassals. This period of decline profoundly marked the history of the 12 tribes of Israel, whose dispersion generated numerous theories about their whereabouts. Some believe the tribes integrated into other cultures, while others argue that they kept their identity secret. Furthermore, this apparent disappearance fuels theological and historical debates, encouraging investigations into how God's covenant with Israel is manifested in modern times. One of the most curious and controversial theories suggests that the Israelites were, in fact, ancestors of indigenous tribes in the Americas, meaning that indigenous peoples would descend from the so-called lost tribes of Israel. While this idea has circulated for centuries, it lacks biblical and scientific support. Genetic studies show that indigenous peoples have predominantly Asian origins, with ancestry from populations in the Far East, Siberia, and other regions of Asia. These findings are corroborated by archaeological and linguistic evidence. Another point that refutes this theory is the absence of physical and cultural similarities between indigenous peoples of the Americas and those from the Middle East. Indigenous people exhibit traits that more directly connect them to populations from the Far East, such as the Chinese, Japanese, Mongols, and Siberians. Moreover, the cultural aspects and ways of life of indigenous peoples differ significantly from those of the ancient Israelites. Proponents of this theory often argue that the tribes of Israel at some point left their homeland and crossed the world to the Americas. However, this idea faces serious historical problems. For example, indigenous peoples of the Americas did not have technologies typical of the Bronze Age, such as the weapons and tools used by the ancient Israelites. While the Israelites were known for their colorful garments decorated with intricate fabrics, indigenous peoples typically adopted distinct styles of clothing, such as body paint, feather adornments, and minimal fabric coverage. Furthermore, physical characteristics are also markedly different. Ancient Semites, such as the Israelites, had traits that included more body hair, something rarely observed among indigenous peoples of the Americas. These genetic, cultural, and historical differences make the theory of a direct connection between the lost tribes of Israel and indigenous American peoples unsustainable. With the advancement of genetic studies conducted on various ethnic groups around the world, ancient theories have completely lost their credibility, as they have been widely disproven. Studies indicate that indigenous peoples of the Americas have DNA more closely related to Asian peoples, which explains physical traits such as almond-shaped eyes and very straight hair. Additionally, some indigenous groups display a more brownish skin tone, a result of mixing with ancient African Cushitic peoples, descendants of Ham. Despite this, they maintain distinct traits of Asian origin reflecting their ancestry, biblically and logically associated with Togarma. If indigenous peoples of the Americas shared genetic similarities with the Israelites, modern Jews, or other Middle Eastern peoples of Semitic origin, there might be a possibility of considering them as lost tribes of Israel. However, genetic studies reveal that no such similarity exists. In fact, there is no significant genetic relation between indigenous peoples and those from the Middle East. In contrast, populations such as Arabs, Syrians, and Lebanese show a strong genetic proximity to Jews, highlighting their common origin. Therefore, it can be concluded that the indigenous peoples of the Americas cannot be classified as lost tribes of Israel. This finding underscores the importance of advancements in genetics to demystify narratives based on assumptions, while deepening our understanding of the origins and historical connections between different ethnic groups around the world. A theory that has gained popularity recently, similar to the idea that indigenous peoples are descendants of the lost tribes of Israel, is the notion that African peoples also have ancestry linked to these tribes. However, this view contrasts entirely with what is accepted by both contemporary Judaism and ancient Jewish traditions, including those of Jews from 1,000 years ago. According to historians like Flavius Josephus, Africans are descendants of Ham, especially from the groups of Cush, Mizraim, and Put, considered the ancestors of African peoples. On the other hand, some theorists argue that these African peoples are actually descendants of the lost tribes of Israel. However, this theory is unsupported by biblical evidence, ancient traditions, or genetics, as there is no genetic similarity between these peoples and those from the Middle East, such as Arabs and Jews. In terms of lineage, therefore, Africans would not be descendants of Semites, but rather of Hamites, that is, of Ham. Moreover, many people claim to be descendants of Jews. But in reality, the only group with Jewish African ancestry are the Ethiopian Jews. Although Ethiopian Jews carry Jewish heritage in their genetics, they are often called Cushitic Jews, due to their primary origin as descendants of Cush, which connects them to a large portion of African peoples, including Ethiopians, Eritreans, Somalis, and other groups from the region. Cush, in the Bible, is associated with the ancient kingdom of Cush, which encompassed Nubia, corresponding to modern-day Sudan. On the other hand, indigenous peoples are generally considered descendants of Togarma, a figure mentioned in traditions associated with people who, according to biblical genealogy, stem from Japheth. Africans, for the most part, are thought to be descendants of Ham and his 3 sons, Mizraim, Cush, and Put, whose descendants spread across Libya and other regions of Africa. This understanding aligns more closely with the traditional biblical view and the ancestral history of different cultures. In addition to the aforementioned theory, there are also some European hypotheses suggesting that the ancient Israelites or the lost tribes might be located in Europe. One of these theories argues that the lost Israelites were, in fact, the British or the Anglo-Saxons. However, this idea lacks any solid foundation. Its proponents often make significant translation errors, such as the incorrect interpretation of David's description as a redhead. In fact, in the original Hebrew, the term used refers to a person with reddish or sun-tanned skin, not someone with red hair. Therefore, this theory lacks any reliable historical or linguistic basis, and does not align with the characteristics of European peoples, such as those with blonde or red hair. Ultimately, apart from the various theories claiming that Jews are actually lost tribes of indigenous peoples, African nations, or even certain European groups, these ideas are nothing more than urban legends. These extra-biblical interpretations, often based on misconceptions, are today disproven by both genetics and biblical analysis. The idea that indigenous or African peoples are lost tribes does not hold up, especially when we consider that indigenous civilizations in the Americas, such as the Mayans, Aztecs, and Incas, were already well established long before the formation of the tribes of Israel and the children of Jacob. Moreover, black peoples in Africa are some of the oldest on the planet, existing long before the formation of any Hebrew or Israelite group. African populations were already deeply established in the region, descendants of Cush, Mizraim, and Put, long before the rise of the people of Israel. The big question that arises is, where are these lost tribes mentioned throughout history? In July, when the Assyrians destroyed Samaria, the Israelite tribes were deported to Assyria. It is important to highlight that at the time of the deportation, Assyria was in direct conflict with Egypt. Therefore, these tribes were never sent to Africa. If these tribes were truly in Africa, the only possible route would have been through Egypt, which was under Egyptian control. However, the Assyrians and Syrians, historical enemies of Egypt, held the Israelites as prisoners within their territory with no possibility of fleeing south. Is there any biblical basis suggesting that these lost tribes are actually in Assyria, Syria, or other areas of the Middle East?
Yes.
In the book of 2 Kings chapter 17 verse 6, we read, "In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria took Samaria and carried Israel away to Assyria, and he placed them in Hala and Harbor, by the river Gozan, and in the cities of the Medes." Over time, many of these Israelite tribes were absorbed by the peoples of the region, including the Assyrians and Syrians who already lived there. Later, the area was conquered by various empires such as the Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, Parthians, Turks, and finally by the Arabs, with the expansion of Islam. You may ask, this is all from the Old Testament written in the period of the Chronicles. And what does the New Testament say about it? In the New Testament, we find mentions of people from different tribes of Israel who do not belong to the tribe of Judah. One example of this is in the Gospel of Luke chapter 2 verse 36, where Anna from the tribe of Asher is mentioned. An example of one of the tribes of Israel that does not belong to the tribe of Judah is the tribe of Benjamin, from which the Apostle Paul, also known as Saul of Tarsus, is one of the most famous representatives. Although there are other verses in the New Testament that mention other tribes, I mentioned these two to illustrate that the Israelites were not completely lost. In fact, the tribes did not disperse to extremely distant places, but suffered conquests and in many cases turned away from God, falling into sin. A question that often generates curiosity is the fate of the tribes of Israel, which are actually found in Assyria, Syria, and other parts of the Middle East. Many people wonder about the fulfillment of biblical prophecies related to these lost tribes. The answer is that they will be saved, but in a way different from what was originally imagined. Jesus Christ transformed the Christians into the new Israel, the true people of God. Before God, the distinction between Jews and Gentiles has disappeared. As the Apostle Paul declares, in Christ, there is neither Jew nor Greek, It was not by chance that these tribes mixed with peoples from Assyria, Syria, and other regions of the Middle East. This mixing has a purpose, that in the end times, these tribes will remember their Israelite heritage, convert to Christ, and be saved. Therefore, all of this is part of the divine plan. Conversion is not based solely on Israelite heritage, but on the recognition that all are part of the heritage of Shem, Noah's son. God's purpose is not to save just one ethnicity or a specific people, but all peoples. Language, origin, or any other characteristic are not decisive. What truly matters is faith in Christ and the acceptance of God as Father. Thus, all those who believe in Christ and become children and servants of God will be saved, not just Israelites or Semites. May God bless you and see you soon.